Promising that 24 lecture. I don't know, there's like all those notes. So in assignment number 4.2, study goal 24, said ask me in class about patchiness and thinning and so on. And actually, we're going to briefly reference study goal 25 today, but almost the entire day is this one story of how we people who love nature kind of messed up collectively. Because of where you live and because of your age, you are some of the most fire traumatized people that I've ever taught. Name a fire. Okay. Let's start with chronological order. How many of you remember the Zaka fire? It was really big, like in the Kuyama drainage, I think. Maybe like Los Olivos area, Santinas. Home damage, threat to your home, evacuation, any of that? Yeah, it affected a lot of people, equestrian access, it kind of messed up some trails. Zaka didn't really hit the front range, so most of us weren't that personally affected by it. What about the T fire? Wow, that's a lot of you. Do y'all like live here? Do y'all live together?
We live in the same house.
All right. T fire. Anybody see the flames? Anybody have to evacuate for that one?
It was like going down the mountainside where we live, so we could see it like jumping houses, and ended up being like 5 houses away from ours.
Yeah, it's pretty horrifying. Anybody's property directly threatened?
My best friend's was.
And anybody here have their homes touched and the property line crossed by the T fire? T was a scary one. If I'm not mistaken, I'm not sure how much of this is clear, but the gossip I heard was some kids partying from Santa Barbara City College had a fire, kind of a low-key session up in the hills. After sunset, they did like a good job of putting out their fire. Everybody there said independently the same method of how they put out the fire. It's possible that they lied, but it looked like they had put out the fire pretty well, covered it up with a bunch of sand. Sometime overnight, most of them left. One of them was still up there, like, I don't know what kind of a weirdo stays out by himself, but sometime overnight the wind picked up and some leaves and brush landed on top of the fire pit, and like it started to smolder. And I'm not really clear on the timing, but sometime the next day it went and made a little flame, and then the wind took some stuff on fire into the bushes, and we started the T fire, which was horrifying. I was teaching the next day, and we could see it coming, and the smoke was really bad. That's the worst ashes we've had during my school day, the T fire. What about the Jesucita? Anybody see flames on that one? I saw those flames. I was right next to it when it started. Anybody's home affected by that one? No kidding.
Yeah.
Burned down?
Went around it.
Dang, dog. On the tunnel trailhead side, or like
across Mission Canyon.
I see. Gnarly. That was a close call. That was a really scary one. That was like the most downtown Santa Barbara one of all these. Do you know the Macy family? You said Mission Canyon? You know, we should talk. I like Mission Canyon. I want you to keep your eyes open for me for a few different things. When we're not on YouTube, we can discuss it. that one I think was some jackass with a weed whacker, right?
Building mountain bike trails.
Maintaining mountain bike trails. Was it part of the Mountain Bike Association, like an official MTBA thing? Somebody threw a spark, basically. So I'm not clear whether the weed whacker backfired or they were using a metal blade. Have you heard conclusively? Somebody threw a spark. And anybody who's ever tried to start a fire with sparks, it's so easy to make a spark, it's so hard to make a fire. Like, spark making is not the obstacle. Like, when you see people doing this thing, like, getting an ember is actually, like, not that complicated. Turning that into flames is not easy. So I was always shocked that the Jesucita started by a spark. I've seen sparks a bazillion times. You know, you ride and like your chain rings will hit a rock or whatever, and you see sparks from the guy in front of you. Like, I don't know, I've seen sparks a lot. People shoot all the time, and when you shoot, sometimes you make sparks, and like, that was a scary one. What about everybody Thomas Fire, right? Like, we all had to leave town, didn't we? Like, I got evacuated, and I live in Goleta. Anybody lose their house on that one? Are you just holding your pencil? No. Yeah, that was a gnarly one. Obviously, the Thomas Fire was started. We think is it settled now? Power lines, Southern California Edison power line.
Yeah,
I think that's what everybody suspects. I'm not sure that's certain, but I think so. I'm not your. Don't write this down. Maybe I'm wrong, but I thought it was power lines. It started over by like Fillmore or something behind Ojai, and then it like crossed over to the 126 33 line, and then it kind of came up behind Ventura and like hit the coast at Carp, I believe. Is that correct?
it jumped the freeway somewhere.
Jumped 101, yeah, that's Carp, I think, and then it came up the line. Obviously, many of you. Anybody see flames on that one? Yeah, I saw them from like the freeway. That's it. The reason I mention these is every one of these examples, plus a bunch of others I could name. Maybe you've heard of the Gap Fire. Maybe you've heard of like the Big Paradise Fire up in NorCal that had the 1-year anniversary a couple weeks ago. The Santa Rosa Fire.
That one almost burned down my grandma's house.
The Getty Fire would be a great example. Getty Fire just started recently. I think it's out now. The Easy Fire, another LA San Bernardino fire. These are our fault. Like, even if they start naturally, not by people, it's our fault that they're so gnarly. And the crazy shocker is, like, I can't blame corporations or like people of a different political stripe. Like, we naturalists screwed ourselves with fire policy. As a weird side detail, in number 25, early conservation included protecting the forest from fire. The very first Americans to say conserve wilderness loudly said we should stop all fires. The early Forest Service, like the National Forest, certainly U.S. Forest Service, their very first set of actions was to just put out fires. How many of you have heard of Smokey the Bear? Only you can prevent forest fires. Have you all heard the story about that? A team of firefighters put out a fire, and in a log they found a burned bear cub. And they used him as an example while he lived. Like, this bear got burned by fire, prevent forest fire. back when the U.S. Forest Service was a wilderness firefighting organization. Bear died a couple years later, so they got a dude to dress up. Smokey the Bear was a real bear, and they called him Smokey. There's this really important book about a man's experiences in nature called the Sand County Almanac. It was written by a guy named Aldo Leopold. I don't think you got to know this for the AP test, but if you're a naturalist, you'll read it eventually. Homeboy lived in like a little cabin next to a lake, and he wrote a book about how amazing it is when you're off the grid. The lie of the book is that he would like leave his cabin once a week to have his mom do laundry and go take groceries from her pantry and then go back to his cabin. So like the most historic book about this romantic involvement with nature was pretty staged. But in that book, America saw like, oh my God, you can have like spiritual transformative experiences in the wilderness. And by the way, when this idea started to pick up some steam, and people like John Muir and Franklin Roosevelt started to connect the American spirit writ large with participation in wilderness, Aldo Leopold said, what's special about the forest is that it's intact. We don't have honking horns and people selling you newspapers and the butcher announcing what's on sale. He said, what's special about the wilderness is that it's untouched by man, and we should keep it perfect like an art collection. And this was the beginning of the end. Sometime in the late 1800s, we started to prevent wildfires everywhere in the US. You got to know that. It's been about 130 years that we've had this idea called wilderness fire prevention.
What year is it again?
I mean, it's kind of different for different jurisdictions. So as a loose average, I always say 1880s, 1890s. I could be off by as much as 50 years depending on where you are. Now, you can walk around a lot of places where you see wilderness. Like here we have a lot of wilderness. We're right up against the edges. But like the foothills that I see from my door at work, some of those haven't seen a fire in 100 years. Like a little fire will start and people run out there and risk their lives to put out those fires. Well-intended people. With the full support of the National Forest Service, the National Park Service, your tax dollars, I mean your mommy and daddy's tax dollars. And after like 100 years, we have this. Please look up. We have landscape-wide, so border to border, landscape-wide, thick undergrowth, with everything crowded. crowding. You get high competition. You get disease. And you get really low growth. I know that you're writing, but I want to come back to this, so leave some space to add more words. Now, I got to explain what this means and why this happened, okay? I can talk a lot about forests. Some of you have never looked outside of your cell phone screens. There's a lot of detail that's difficult for you to imagine, but I want to remind you that plants need stuff to grow. They need space and they need nutrients and they need water. So if Sol and I are two little saplings and we grow and we grow and he grows and grows, look at this. Eventually we're going to bump up against each other and now we can't really grow anymore because we're crowded. Sorry, we gotta have a moment. And then like our roots can't go any further because they're like competing with each other, and we just max out. It's so cute, you guys. But we max out. This is really high competition. You get no more growth. And forests will kind of stall. Where the trees don't get any bigger, no light hits the ground, and anything that's died in the last 100 years of anything is just sitting there getting drier. So disease spreads because nobody's growing, nobody's healthy. Everything's all arid. There's no more nutrients in the soil. They're all living in the biomass. And the forest is kind of like freezes in place with this accumulation of dry undergrowth. I have to add that word. Thick, dry undergrowth. It was just brought to my attention that all of you know what Tinder means now. Let's not out anybody's Tinder secrets here. But I am told that Tinder has a known logo that every high school kid already knows.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's the app icon itself or if it's just in their publications, but
Yeah, it's
It's a fire.
it's a fire. Yes, more precisely a flame, a teardrop flame.
What is the difference between fire and flame?
Fire's a bunch of flames.
I kind of feel like fire is like things that are burning, but flame is the thing that you see at the top of the candle wick. Anyway, a tinder box is a box of kindling. It's a term that most of you don't use because you don't live with fire. If you lived in a cabin in the mountains 100 years ago, everybody would know what a tinder box is. It's like a metal crate where you keep like little bits of dry grass, shredded newspaper, and really flammable small material for that moment when you need to kindle a spark into a flame. How Tinder works for all of us.
Yeah.
Supposedly. Tinderbox is, in other words, a big pile of kindling. When you haven't burned it, it's just waiting to go off. The fires that you have been raised with are inherently unnatural. The generations that came before you set you up to burn.
Yay.
Coincidentally, climate change doesn't help. Coincidentally, the fact that we like to live in the trees doesn't help. Coincidentally, the expansion of our cities doesn't help. But we shot ourselves in the foot for 100 years in a row, over and over and over again. In a healthy forest, we said, no fire. And then the dead stuff kept accumulating. And we said, no fire. And the dead stuff kept accumulating. And then we said, no fire. And the dead stuff kept accumulating. And you can see where this ends up because you've lived through them. If you throw a single spark into these types of forests, the fire will light easily, get very hot, spread very fast, last a lot longer, and recover more slowly than it should. Everything bad about fire is worse because of our wilderness fire prevention policies. Yeah.
So are you for like controlled burns and stuff like that?
Oxymoron!
What did you just call her?
I called her an oxymoron. By which I mean you really don't get to control burns. And so the sketchy thing is that everybody imagines that if you just line up a bunch of firefighters, everything's going to be fine. You can just light it on fire. We have this really naive notion that like, hey, you know, just like light it on fire, just stand by. And like when you start that fire in these conditions, you better be running really fast or you are dead meat. We don't get to control fires in these conditions. It's no longer an alternative. What we now describe as controlled burns is something entirely different from what most people imagine. So in a cleared environment, we can make a pile of outdoor bonfire, yes. Like if you go to a forest, you can cut it all down, make a big pile in the middle of the clearing and light that. That's not a controlled burn. That's a huge Viking bonfire. But controlled burn in the sense of burning the landscape and then being ready to stop it, we don't, that is not a good call. It is against specific national park and forest policy by now. In the continental US. They just lost a huge controlled burn in Alaska when I was there, and the Kenai Peninsula had like the largest wildfire in the history of Kenai, I believe. I could see it while I was visiting this summer. Look, by lighting easily, I mean anywhere you drop a spark, it's dry and overgrown. In a wild forest, there's patches of grass, there's green shrubbery, there's a bunch of bare dirt where there's trees far overhead. So in a natural forest, 99 out of 100 sparks don't hit something flammable. But since we're living in a tinderbox, every spark hits something flammable. Again, your generation not raised with fire. There's like 100 million variables to make a good fire, and it's pretty tough to make a really hot fire. If you're like working with like green grass from your front lawn and you try to make a fire, that takes a lot of work. It's not easy. But if you're working here, every fire is really, really hot. And please look up. If a fire starts right there, any way the wind blows, that fire is going to spread. You see what I'm saying? Any way the wind blows? you have a 100% chance of that spark making a fire, a 100% chance of that material burning really, really hot, and then you have a 100% chance of the wind fueling this fire, because any wind direction will spread that fire. You understand what I'm saying by this? Because there's no break in the action, these fires just, they burn taller, they burn deeper into the ground, and they spread in all directions, so they last a really long time. Everything goes on fire. We get devastatingly long fires, and they never recover because it's so hot you kill all the seeds. You should know that seeds are kind of fireproof. Also, check this out. Does anybody remember the difference? Well, like, what's the difference between sand and soil? What's the secret ingredient of soil?
Clay.
Shut up.
Nutrients. Water.
Which come from?
Organic material.
Yes, yes, yes. Remember how we had that soil diagram where I told you the secret ingredient, the magic, is the organic material? The O horizon?
Yeah. Oh.
When you light all that stuff on fire, all you're left with is sand. If the fire's hot enough, you literally turn the dirt into little glass pieces. I can't remember the name of this fire, but there was a fire just outside Yosemite, just downhill of Hetch Hetchy. And I went to go walk through some of that, and people told me, I don't know if I believe this, that the soil temperature was over 2,000 degrees at some places. So literally you would walk, and the glass was like really fine pumice. Sorry, the ground was like really fine pumice made of glass. And it looked all shiny and like silvery, like almost like mylar, but not quite that reflective. And you would walk and it would go, and you could hear it just like shattering into pieces. And you had to wear a respirator because you could get like bloody lungs from breathing all that dust because it's just glass. This is not the fire that like we used to talk about 100 years ago. These are new conditions. Fire reaches a temperature where there's nothing organic left. It's just sand. And if you burn sand enough, it gets into glass. And imagine, anywhere you light this fire, it's gonna, that was a good one? If you light this fire, that's going to spread all the way to the edges. So where's your closest source of seeds? How far is the bird that could drop a seed? These big fires have no edges to contribute material to recover. So here's where we grew up. In our life, fires are devastating. They're ecologically damaging. By the way, any human that gets in the way is toast.
Huh. Like burning.
Oh God, that was horribly graphic. I did not mean to do that. That was actually an unintentionally tacky pun. I just made myself sweat right there. But yeah, these are really deadly fires. The likelihood of retiring as a firefighter has gone steeply downhill in the last 20, 30 years. Oh, it's horrifying. There's a lot of fires that we no longer fight because we can't afford to burn more firefighters. Like back in the day, you'd send the firefighters into the forest. Now the firefighters just go, and we can't afford to light our firefighters on fire. So there's all sorts of conditions now. The reason you evacuate is the firefighter won't come into your house if you're on fire anymore. Like, this is too gnarly. Sorry, bro. Like, fires move too fast. They're too hot. Like, it's too sketchy. And of course, bottom line issues, brass tacks. Any fire that starts now is super expensive. You've probably heard that California is starting to fight with the federal government about fire policy because the feds argue that they can't be expected to help us deal with these emergencies because it's kind of our fault because of all this forest. By the way, it's national forest, but anyway. Our Our state has a lot of that national forest. We've painted ourselves into a corner. If you live in a place that has these surroundings, any fire is like a very serious threat. Ecologically, financially, human death. P.S. The Thomas Fire, which was that big double whammy that you keep hearing about, we wouldn't have had the second part of the whammy if the fire was mellow. But because that fire was so burly, there was no surviving trees, so the whole erosion part that came after, you know, the Thomas Fire mudslides, that's only because the fire was so intense. It didn't need to be that intense. We could have survived that flooding if we still had trees on the hills. I keep talking about what's natural. What's natural is this. We call this patchiness. You'll notice each of these patches burned at a different time. 1 year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 12 years ago, 15, 25, 30, 50, 100 years ago. If you want to take a minute, I can wait. Those numbers represent when it burned. Now, all you got to know about these conditions is they've had fires. If somebody hadn't come along to put out all these fires, they would have kept having fires. But now watch. Because all of these areas are at different stages of succession, like, what do you see in the first year after a fire? That's not a rhetorical question. What do you see after the first year of a fire?
Topsoil.
Yeah, we've like, assuming that the topsoil survived, you've got like little sprouting weeds and stuff. It's gonna be pretty thin, but there's some weeds out there. 2 years after a fire, more weeds, thicker with weeds, right? After 5 years, you might start to get a couple of the pickier stuff, middle succession, right? 12, 15, you might start getting into late succession. Maybe some of the specialists are starting to recover. By 25, 30 years, you've basically got all your native diversity. They're starting to come back. The oak trees are growing, and you've got all the different flowers and shrubberies, and a lot of the animals are coming back. Now here, when you get a fire, many of them don't even grow. You get a spark that goes psss, and just dies out. Because like, if you're going to try to light a bunch of weeds on fire, good luck. They're just like thin, wispy green stuff. Who cares? First of all, most of those sparks don't get into being a big fire. The fire might just bump into a rock and be like, nah. Because the fires are so small that they're just not like a landscape on fire. You will never see that. I mean, not likely see it. Yeah.
Lucy said most of the time that's the case with fires, that they like where the burns barely grow and they're cooler and stuff. You think that mostly happens?
Yeah.
Okay.
Next, on average, they're cooler because there's more green and less dead. See, all this is green, 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 green. You don't have a lot of dead stuff except for maybe here and there. So most of that fire, if it catches, would be relatively low temperature. In a cooler fire, the seeds are fine. In a cooler fire, stuff doesn't burn all the way. So you get like chips of like wood, like coals, you know? Little charcoal chunks, ashes on the ground. These spread slowly, so they're not going to get too far before the wind dies. They're not going to get too far before the next rain. These recover easily because look at this. You have a lot of seed donors around. The soil still has nutrients in it. There might even be some surviving trees and stuff. So this recovery is pretty mellow. You just light a few things on fire and the rest just grow bigger. It's kind of nice. If you have surviving trees, you might even have like more moisture in the ground because there's less things sucking it out, but a thicker layer of organic material. In other words, in nature, fires are beneficial, rejuvenating. They're kind of a pretty thing. And they increase biodiversity because in this landscape, we have primary succession happening, early secondary, middle secondary, late secondary succession. That's a diverse landscape. By the way, it's not even on the whiteboard. This one absorbs more carbon because there's so much growing happening. And the question for your generation is, how do we get back? Everybody says, oh, you know, controlled burns. Like, nope, you don't really get to control the burn. Once it's like this, no burn. It's like no fire, fire's scary.
Separate the bit into sections.
Yeah, the goal is to make artificial patchiness. That's what thinning is. Thinning is to reverse these. Thinning is to remove all the undergrowth, lower some of that competition, cut out the disease, which is what a fire would have done anyway. And I gotta tell you before the bell rings, we can continue after the bell or tomorrow, but I want to get a punchline here. You can also watch this on YouTube later if you need to catch up on notes. But an important thing for you to know is thinning is not logging. There's nothing of value. Undergrowth isn't worth anything. So thinning is doing all the work of a clear cut without the payoff of the clear cut. Thinning is extremely expensive.
Well, is that why there hasn't been much done?
That's why we do so little of it. In the few places we've done it, it works.
Where have we done it in the past?
Yosemite is a good example. You drive right past it. In Yosemite, you can see healthier rivers, more birds, more wildflowers, more butterfly diversity, less damaging wildfires because we've cleared underbrush. And I was alive when this happened. It's been about 15, 20 years now. Luke, will you stop the screen? I need burritos, I'm starving! I need burritos, I'm starving!